What does every great trial have that this trial hasn't had yet? A surprise witness! Recall that the Chamberses said that they and the Hisses were good friends from 1934 through 1938. The Hisses said, on the contrary, their acquaintance with the Chamberses, they wouldn't call it a friendship, was over by the end of 35, and they were emphatic they never visited the Chamberses in Baltimore. Well, into the courtroom walked a middle-aged black woman, and she testified as follows. My name is Edith Murray, and at all pertinent times I lived in Baltimore. I used to be a domestic servant. From time to time in 1934, 1935, and 1936, I worked as a cleaning woman and cook, off and on, for a family that I knew as the Cantwells, but whom I now recognize as Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker Chambers. Professor Younger used to say that he imagined members of the jury looking at each other and saying, communist spies have servants, only in America. She said, the last time I worked for them was in the spring of 1936. Mr. Cantwell, as I knew him then, Whittaker Chambers, was there only on the weekends. I was told he was a traveling salesman. The Chamberses had no social life, no friends, except for one young white married couple. And I now recognize them as Mr. and Mrs. Alger Hiss. I remember that the name I used for the woman, whom I now recognize as Mrs. Hiss, was Miss Priscilla. One journalist wrote that when Mrs. Murray stood up on the witness stand and pointed at Mrs. Hiss turned deathly white. Mrs. Murray continued, Mr. and Mrs. Hiss visited the Chambers house in Baltimore together once, and I remember Mrs. Hiss visiting Mrs. Chambers in Baltimore 3 more times. There were probably more visits that I saw, but there are 4 that I distinctly remember. The 2 women were good friends. In particular, this must have happened in the spring of 1936. Mrs. Chambers had to go to New York to see a doctor when she was pregnant with her 2nd child. Mrs. Hiss, Miss Priscilla, came up from Washington. And then when she moved into the Chambers apartment, Mrs. Chambers left to go to New York. Mrs. Hiss stayed in the Chambers apartment overnight and took care of their 2-year-old girl. The last time I saw them together was also in 1936. And of course, this is long after the Hisses said we got them out of our lives. On cross-examination, Mrs. Murray may have been slightly embarrassed. It turned out that in 1942, she had some kind of nervous breakdown and had hardly left home for the following years, and this mental infirmity was bought out. If that makes you believe that her memory wasn't so good, then so be it. Also, to get her to identify the Hisses, the FBI used a method that was much more suggestive than would be permitted today. They showed her a picture of Mrs. Hiss and said, do you recognize this lady? And Mrs. Murray said yes, although at first she thought she was maybe an actress, maybe I saw her in the movies. Today, they would have just presented Mrs. Murray with a lot of pictures of young white women and said, do you find the person who you know in this pile? Personally, I have little doubt that her recognition was honest on her part. To believe that she was misidentifying the Hisses, you'd have to believe that the Chambers knew another young white couple whose identity has remained a mystery for 60 years and whose female half was named Priscilla. Who else could Miss Priscilla be? And maybe Mrs. Murray thought Mrs. Hiss might be an actress because she'd been going to the movies despite her nervous breakdown, and she might have seen Mrs. Hiss in some kind of newsreel. Now, Mrs. Murray, like the car transfer and so much else, undermined Hiss's story that his relationship with Chambers had been brief, strictly business, unpleasant, and ended in 1935. And it supported Chambers' story that the relationship had been long, and particularly in the overnight care of the Chambers' 2-year-old, friendly and trusting. So Hedda Massing, Dr. Binger, and Mrs. Murray are the main ways that the testimony in the second trial differed from the first. Next, the final summations and the verdict.